Samuel Johnson. 1. Deformative years, 1709 to 1746. He was unique and yet typical, unlike any Englishman of his time, yet summarizing John Bull in body and soul. Surpassed in every literary field, except lexicography, by his contemporaries, yet dominating them for a generation, reigning over them without raising anything but his voice. Let us record briefly the blows that beat him into his peculiar form. He was the first child born to Michael Johnson, bookseller, printer, and stationer in Lichfield, 118 miles from London. The mother, née Sarah Ford, was of slightly genteel stock. She was 37 when, in 1706, she married Michael, who was 50. Samuel was a sickly child, so weak at birth that he was baptized at once, lest, dying unchristened, he should, by the laws of theology, be lodged forever in limbo, the gloomy vestibule of hell. He soon showed signs of scrofula. When he was 30 months old, his mother, though pregnant with her second son, took him on the long ride to London to be touched for the king's evil by Queen Anne. The queen did her best, but the disease cost Johnson the use of one eye and one ear, and shared with other tribulations in disfiguring his face. Nevertheless, he grew strong in muscle and frame, and his strength as well as his bulk supported that absolutism which, as Goldsmith complained, turned the Republic of Letters into a monarchy. Samuel thought that he had inherited from his father the vile melancholy which has made me mad all my life, at least not sober. Perhaps, as in Cooper's case, his hypochondria had a religious as well as a physical basis. Johnson's mother was a firm Calvinist who thought that eternal damnation was just around the corner. Samuel suffered from fear of hell to the day of his death. From his father he derived his Tory politics, Jacobite leanings, and a passion for books. He read eagerly in his father's store. Later he told Boswell, "I knew almost as much at 18 as I do now." After some elementary instruction, he passed on to Lichfield Grammar School, where the headmaster was so brutal that no man who had been educated by him sent his son to the same school. However, when asked in after years how he had acquired so good a command of Latin, he answered, "My master whipped me very well. Without that, sir, I should have done nothing." In old age he deplored the obsolescence of the rod. There is now less flogging in our great schools than formerly, but then less is learned there, so that what the boys get at one end, they lose at the other. In 1728 his parents found means to send him to Oxford. There he devoured the Greek and Latin classics and harassed his teachers by insubordination. In December 1729 he hurried back to Lichfield, perhaps because parental funds ran out, or because his hypochondria had come so close to madness that he needed medical treatment. He received this at Birmingham. Then, instead of returning to Oxford, he helped in his father's shop. When the father died in December 1731, Samuel went to work as assistant teacher in a school at Market Bosworth. Soon tiring of this, he moved to Birmingham, lived with a bookseller, and made 5 guineas by translating a book about Abyssinia. This was a distant source of Rasselas. In 1734 he returned to Lichfield, where his mother and brother were carrying on the store. On July 9, 1735, 2 months short of 26, he married Elizabeth Porter, a widow of 48, with 3 children and £700. With her money he opened a boarding school at nearby Edial. David Garrick, a Lichfield boy, was one of his pupils, but there were not enough to reconcile him to pedagogy. Authorship was fermenting in him. He wrote a drama, Irene, and sent word to Edward Cave, editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, explaining how that periodical could be improved. On March 2, 1737, he rode off to London with David Garrick and 1 horse to sell his tragedy and carve out a place for himself in the cruel world. His appearance was against him. He was thin and tall, but with a large bony frame that made him a mass of angles. His face was blotched with scrofula, and was frequently agitated by a convulsive twitch. His body was subject to alarming starts. His conversation was illustrated by odd gesticulations. One bookseller to whom he applied for work advised him to get a porter's knot and carry trunks. Apparently he received some encouragement from Cave, for in July he went back to Lichfield and brought his wife to London. He was not without subtlety. When Cave was attacked in the press, Johnson wrote a poem in his defense and sent it to him. Cave published it, gave him literary commissions, and joined Dodsley in issuing, in May 1738, Johnson's London, for which they gave him 10 guineas. The poem frankly imitated Juvenal's third satire, and therefore emphasized the lamentable aspects of the city that the author soon learned to love. It was also an attack upon the administration of Robert Walpole, whom Johnson later described as the best minister this country ever had. The poem was in part the angry blast of a country youth who, after a year in London, was still uncertain of tomorrow's food. Hence the famous line, "Slow rises worth, by poverty depressed." In those days of struggle, Johnson turned his pen to every genre. He wrote Lives of Eminent Persons in 1740, and various articles for the Gentleman's Magazine, including imaginary reports of parliamentary debates. Since reporting of the debates was as yet forbidden, Cave hit on the expedient of pretending that his magazine was merely recording debates in the Senate of Magna Lilliputian. In 1741, Johnson took over this task. For general information as to the course of discussion in Parliament, he composed speeches which he ascribed to characters whose names were anagrams for the main contenders in the House. The debates bore such an air of verisimilitude that many readers took them as verbatim reports, and Johnson had to warn Smollett, who was writing a history of England, not to rely on them as factual. Once, hearing praise of a speech ascribed to Chatham, Johnson remarked, "That speech I wrote in a garret in Exeter Street." When someone commended the impartiality of his reports, he confessed, "I saved appearances tolerably well, but I took care that the Whig dogs should not have the best of it." How was he paid for his work? He once called Cave a penurious paymaster, but he frequently professed affection for his memory. Between August 2nd, 1738, and April 21st, 1739, Cave paid him £49. And in 1744 Johnson estimated £50 a year as undoubtedly more than the necessities of life require. However, Johnson has been traditionally described as living in dire poverty in London in those years. Boswell believed that Johnson and Savage were sometimes in such extreme indigence that they could not pay for a lodging, so that they wandered whole nights in the streets. And Macaulay assumed that those months of penury habituated Johnson to slovenliness of dress and a ravenous greediness in eating. Richard Savage claimed, unconvincingly, to be the son of an earl, but he had become a wastrel when Johnson met him in 1737. They roamed the streets because they loved taverns more than their rooms. Boswell mentions, with all possible respect and delicacy, that Johnson's conduct after he came to London and had associated with Savage and others was not so strictly virtuous in one respect as when he was a younger man. It was well known that his amorous inclinations were uncommonly strong and impetuous. He owned to many of his friends that he used to take women of the town to taverns and hear them relate their history. In short, it must not be concealed that, like many other good and pious men, did Boswell have Boswell in mind? Johnson was not free from propensities which were ever warring against the law of his mind, and that in his combats with them he was sometimes overcome. Savage left London in July 1739 and died in a debtor's prison in 1743. A year later, Johnson issued The Life of Richard Savage, which Henry Fielding called as just and well-written a piece as of its kind I ever saw. It presaged and was later included in the Lives of the Poets. It was published anonymously, but literary London soon discovered Johnson's authorship. The booksellers began to think of him as the man to compile a dictionary of the English language. 2. The Dictionary, 1746 to 1755. Hume had written in 1741, "We have no dictionary of our language, and scarcely a tolerable grammar." He was mistaken, for Nathaniel Bailey had published An Universal Etymological English Dictionary in 1721, and this had had predecessors semi-lexicographical. The proposal for a new dictionary was apparently made by Robert Dodsley in the presence of Johnson, who said, "I believe I shall not undertake it." But when other booksellers joined Dodsley in offering Johnson £1,575 if he would assume the obligation, he signed the contract June 18, 1746. After much rumination, he drew up a 34-page plan for a dictionary of the English language and had it printed. He sent this to several persons, among them Lord Chesterfield, then Secretary of State, with some hopeful praise of the Earl's excellence in English and other departments. Chesterfield invited him to call. Johnson did. The Earl gave him £10 and a word of encouragement. Later Johnson called again, was kept waiting an hour, left in anger, and abandoned the idea of dedicating his work to Chesterfield. He went to his task leisurely, then more diligently, for his fee was meted out to him in installments. When he reached the word lexicographer, he defined it as a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge. He had hoped to finish in 3 years. He took 9. In 1749 he moved to Gough Square, off Fleet Street. He hired, and himself paid for, 5 or 6 secretaries, and set them to work in a third-floor room. He read the recognized English authors of the century from 1558 to 1660, from the accession of Elizabeth I to that of Charles II. He believed that the English language had in that period reached its highest excellence, and he proposed to take that Elizabethan Jacobean speech as a standard by which to establish good usage. He drew a line under each sentence that he proposed to quote as illustrating the use of a word, and noted in the margin the first letter of the word to be defined. His aides were instructed to copy each marked sentence on a separate slip and insert this at its alphabetical place in Bailey's dictionary, which served as a starting point and guide. During these 9 years he took many holidays from definitions. Sometimes he found it easier to write a poem than to define a word. On January 9, 1749, he issued a 12-page poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes. Like the London of a decade earlier, it was in form an imitation of Juvenal, but it spoke with a power that was his own. He still resented his poverty and Chesterfield's neglect. There mark what ills the scholar's life assail, toil, envy, want, the patron and the jail. How vain are the warrior's victories! See Charles XII of Sweden. He left the name at which the world grew pale to point a moral or adorn a tale. How foolish, then, to pray for long life when we see the vanity, deceptions, and pains of old age, the mind wandering in repeated anecdotes, fortune shaking with every day's events, children scheming for a legacy and mourning death's delay, while unnumbered maladies the joints invade, lay siege to life and press the dire blockade. From vain hopes and sure decay there is only one escape, prayer and faith in a redeeming, rewarding God. Yet this pessimist had happy moments. On February 6, 1749, Garrick staged Irene. It was a great event for Johnson. He washed himself, bound his paunch in a scarlet waistcoat, trimmed with gold lace, flourished a hat likewise adorned, and watched his friend play Mohammed II to Mrs. Cibber's Irene. The tragedy ran for 9 nights and brought Johnson £200. It was never revived, but Dodsley gave him another £100 for the copyright. He was now, in 1749, sufficiently famous and opulent to found a club. Not the club, which came 15 years later, but the Ivy Lane Club, so named from the street where, at the King's Head Tavern, Johnson, Hawkins, and 7 others met on Tuesday evenings to eat beefsteak and to barter prejudices. Thither, said Johnson, I constantly resorted. Every Tuesday and Friday from March 21, 1750 to March 14, 1752, he wrote a little essay published by Cave as The Rambler, for which he received 4 guineas a week. The essays sold fewer than 500 copies, and Cave lost money on the venture, but when they were collected into a book they achieved 12 editions before Johnson's death. Shall we confess that the only numbers that we found interesting are 170 and 171, in which Johnson made a prostitute point a moral and adorn her tale? Critics complained that the style and vocabulary were too sesquipedalianly Latinesque, but Boswell, between sins, found comfort in Johnson's exhortations to piety. Johnson was under special strain in those years, for his mind was fatigued by definitions, and his spirits were depressed by the deterioration of his wife. Tetty calmed the pains of age and solitude with alcohol and opium. Often she kept Johnson from her bed. He rarely took her with him when he dined out. Dr. Taylor, who knew both of them intimately, said she was the plague of Johnson's life, was abominably drunken and despicable in every way, and Johnson frequently complained of his situation with such a wife. Her death on March 28, 1752, made him forget her faults, and he developed a post-mortem uxoriousness that amused his friends. He extolled her virtues, lamented his loneliness, and hoped she would intercede for him with Christ. He told me, Boswell recalled, that he generally went abroad at 4 in the afternoon and seldom came home till 2 in the morning. His place of frequent resort was the Mitre Tavern in Fleet Street, where he loved to sit up late. To be alone was terror, so Johnson, after his wife's death, took into his Gough Square home in 1752 Anna Williams, a Welsh poetess who was losing her sight. An operation to cure her failed, and she became completely blind. Except for short intervals, she stayed with Johnson till her death in 1783, superintending the household and the kitchen and carving the roast, and judging the fullness of cups with no other guide than her fingers. To care for his more intimate needs, Johnson, in 1753, took a Negro servant, Frank Barber, who remained with him 29 years. Johnson sent him to school, labored to have him learn Latin and Greek, and left him a substantial legacy. To complete the establishment, Johnson invited a derelict doctor, Robert Levitt, to live with him in 1760. The three formed a quarrelsome ménage, but Johnson was thankful for their company. In January 1755, he sent the final sheets of the dictionary to the printer, who thanked God that he was nearly finished with such a job and such a man. News of the approaching publication reached Chesterfield, who hoped for a dedication. He tried to atone for his former invisibility by writing, for a magazine, 2 articles hailing the expected work and praising Johnson as one whom he would be glad to accept as dictator of good English usage. The proud author sent the Earl, on February 7, 1755, a letter which Carlyle described as that far-famed blast of doom proclaiming that patronage should be no more. My Lord, I have been lately informed by the proprietor of the World that 2 papers in which my dictionary is recommended to the public were written by your lordship. To be so distinguished is an honor, which, being little accustomed to favors from the great, I know not well how to receive, or in what terms to acknowledge. 7 years, my lord, have now passed since I waited in your outward room, or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication, without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favor. Such treatment I did not expect, for I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labors, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent, and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary, and cannot impart it, till I am known, and do not want it. I hope it is no more cynical asperity not to confess obligations where no benefit has been received, or to be unwilling that the public should consider me as owing that to a patron which Providence has enabled me to do for myself. Having carried on my work thus far with so little obligation to any favorer of learning, I shall not be disappointed, though I should conclude it, if less be possible, with less. For I have long been wakened from that dream of hope in which I once boasted myself with so much exaltation. My lord, your lordship's most humble, most obedient servant, Samuel Johnson. Chesterfield's only comment on the letter was that it was very well written. And indeed it is a masterpiece of 18th-century prose, quite free from the Latin derivatives that had sometimes clogged and burdened Johnson's style. Its author must have felt and pondered it deeply, for he recited it to Boswell from memory 26 years later. It was not published till after Johnson's death. Presumably his resentment discolored his condemnation of Chesterfield's letters to his son, that They teach the morals of a whore and the manners of a dancing master. Johnson went up to Oxford early in 1755, partly to consult the libraries, but also to suggest to his friend Thomas Warton that it would help float the dictionary if its author could put a degree after his name. Warton managed it, and in March Johnson was made an honorary Master of Arts. So at last the dictionary was published in 2 large folio volumes of almost 2,300 pages, priced at £4.10. In ending the preface, Johnson proclaimed that the English dictionary was written with little assistance of the learned and without any patronage of the great, not in the soft obscurities of retirement or under the shelter of academic bowers, but amid inconvenience and distraction, in sickness and in sorrow. And it may repress the triumph of malignant criticism to observe that if our language is not here fully displayed, I have only failed in an attempt which no human powers have hitherto completed. I have protracted my work till most of those whom I wish to please have sunk into the grave, and success and miscarriage are empty sounds. I therefore dismiss it with frigid tranquillity, having little to fear or hope from censure or praise. The critics could not be expected to realize that Johnson's dictionary marked a crest and watershed in the English literature of the 18th century, as the Encyclopédie, 1751 to 1772, of Diderot and d'Alembert, marked a crest and turning point in the literature of France. Much fun was made of incidental defects in Johnson's work. Among the 40,000 entries there were oddities like gentilicious and sigillate, which are respectfully preserved by Webster. There were angry definitions like that of pension, an allowance made to anyone without an equivalent. In England it is generally understood to mean pay given to a state hireling for treason to his country. Or excise, a hateful tax on commodities. There were personal quirks, as in the definition of oats. A grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people, which was quite true. Boswell asked Johnson if civilization was a word. He said no, but civility was. Many of Johnson's etymologies are now rejected. He had much Latin and less Greek, but was poorly acquainted with modern languages. He admitted frankly that etymology was his weak point. He defined pastern as the knee of a horse. It is part of a horse's foot. When a lady asked him how he came to make such a mistake, he answered, "Ignorance, madam, pure ignorance." In so large a work, whose every page gave a dozen openings to error, he could not escape missteps. Johnson's achievement was appreciated abroad. The French Academy sent him a copy of its Dictionnaire, and the Accademia della Crusca of Florence sent him its Vocabulario. The dictionary sold well enough to please the booksellers, who paid Johnson to prepare an abbreviated edition. The larger form remained standard until Noah Webster replaced it in 1828. It placed Johnson at the head of English authors in his time. He actually acquired, except for aristocrats like Horace Walpole, a dictatorship over English letters. The reign of the great Cam of literature began. Cam meant Khan. The phrase was apparently first used by Smollett in a letter to Wilkes, March 16, 1759. 3. The Charmed Circle. However, he was not above being arrested for debt. He had spent his payment for the dictionary as fast as it came. On March 16, 1756, he wrote to Samuel Richardson, "Sir, I am obliged to entreat your assistance. I am now under arrest for £5 18s. If you will be so good as to send me this sum, I will gratefully repay you, and add it to all former obligations." Richardson sent 6 guineas. He earned his bread at this time by writing magazine articles, by composing sermons at 2 guineas for less articulate clergymen, by taking advance subscriptions to his promised edition of Shakespeare, and by contributing to the Universal Chronicle a weekly essay, from April 15, 1758 to April 5, 1760, under the name of The Idler. These were in a lighter vein than the Rambler, but still too grave and ponderous for those who must run as they read. One denounced vivisection, another exposed debtors' prisons. Number 5 lamented the separation of soldiers from their wives and proposed squads of lady hussars, who would handle commissary and nursing and otherwise comfort their men. In January 1759, he learned that his 90-year-old mother, whom he had not seen in 22 years, was nearing death. He borrowed money from a printer and sent her 6 guineas in a tender letter. She died on January 23rd. To pay for her funeral and her debts, he wrote in the evenings of one week, so he told Reynolds, the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. He sent it to the printer part by part and received £100 for it. On its publication in April, the critics hailed it as a classic and contrasted it patriotically with Voltaire's Candide, which appeared almost at the same time and dealt with the same problem. Can life bring happiness? Johnson did not delay his answer. Ye who listen with phantoms of hope, who expect that old age will perform the promises of youth, and that the deficiencies of the present day will be supplied by the morrow, attend to the history of Rasselas. It was the custom of Abyssinian kings, Johnson tells us, to confine the heir to the throne to a pleasant and fertile valley until the time came for his accession. Everything was supplied him, a palace, good food, animal pets, intelligent companions. But in his 26th year, Rasselas wearies of these delights. He misses not only liberty, but struggle. I should be happy if I had something to pursue. He ponders how he may escape this peaceful valley to see how other men seek and find happiness. A skillful mechanic proposes to build a flying machine that will lift the prince and himself above the encircling mountains to freedom. He explains, "He that can swim needs not despair to fly. To swim is to fly in a grosser fluid, and to fly is to swim in a subtler. We are only to proportion our power of resistance to the different density of matter through which we pass. You will be necessarily upborne by the air if you can renew any impulse upon it faster than the air can recede from the pressure. The labor of rising from the ground will be great, but as we mount higher, the earth's attraction and the body's gravity will be gradually diminished till we arrive at a region where the man will float in the air without any tendency to fall." Rasselas encourages the mechanic, who agrees to make a plane, but only on this condition, that the art shall not be divulged, and that you shall not require me to make wings for any but ourselves. "Why," asks the prince, "should you envy others so great an advantage?" "If men were all virtuous," the mechanic replies, "I should with great alacrity teach them to fly. But what would be the security of the good if the bad could at pleasure invade them from the sky?" He builds a plane, tries to fly, and falls into a lake from which the prince rescues him. Rasselas likes better to talk with Imlac the philosopher, who has seen many lands and men. They find a cave that leads to a passage into the outer world. They escape from their paradise with the prince's sister Nakaya and her maid. Armed with jewels as universal currency, they visit Cairo, join its pleasures, and tire of them. They hear a Stoic philosopher discourse on the conquest of passions. A few days later they find him wild with grief over his daughter's death. Having read pastoral poetry, they presume that shepherds must be happy. But they discover that the hearts of these men are cankered with discontent, and with malevolence toward those that are placed above them. They come upon a hermit, and learn that he secretly longs for the delights of the city. They inquire into domestic felicity, and find every home darkened with discord and the rude collisions of contrary desires. They explore the pyramids and judge them the summit of folly. They learn about the happy life of scholars and scientists. They meet a famous astronomer who tells them that integrity without knowledge is weak and useless, and knowledge without integrity is dangerous and dreadful. But the astronomer goes mad. They conclude that no way of life on earth leads to happiness, and Imlac comforts them with a discourse on the immortality of the soul. They resolve to return to Abyssinia and accept the vicissitudes of life calmly in the confidence of a blessed resurrection. It is an old story in one of its finest incarnations. What amazes us is the graceful flow and clarity of the style, far removed from the ponderous vocabulary of Johnson's essays and even of his conversation. It seemed impossible that the learned lexicographer had written this simple tale, and quite incredible that he had turned out these 141 pages in 7 days. Meanwhile, he had moved again from Gough Square to Staple Inn on March 23, 1759. Soon he would move to Gray's Inn, then to Inner Temple Lane. These changes were probably motivated by economy. But in July 1762, Johnson was suddenly lifted into relative affluence by a pension of £300 a year granted him by George III on the advice of Lord Bute. Why this beneficence fell upon a man who had persistently opposed the Hanoverian dynasty, had belabored the Scots at every turn, and had described a pension as pay given to a state hireling for treason to his country, has been the subject of many mystery stories. Johnson's enemies charged him with preferring money to principles, and assumed that Bute was looking for a mighty pen to answer Wilkes, Churchill, and others who were denigrating him with ink. Johnson claimed that he had accepted the pension on the explicit understanding, twice confirmed by Bute, that he would not be asked to write in support of the government. He confided to Boswell that the pleasure of cursing the House of Hanover and drinking King James's health was amply overbalanced by £300 a year. In any case, he earned the pension many times over, not so much by the political tracts of later years, but by enriching English literature with pen and speech, with wisdom and cleansing wit. He had enough friends to afford a scattering of enemies. Friendship, he said, is the cordial drop to make the nauseous draught of life go down. In almost every gathering that he attended, he became the center of conversation, not so much because he forced his way to it, but because he was the most individual personality in the literary circles of London, and could be relied upon to say something whenever he spoke. It was Reynolds who suggested the formation of the Club, which Boswell later called the Literary Club. Johnson seconded the motion, and on April 16, 1764, the new group began its Monday evening meetings at the Turk's Head in Gerrard Street, Soho. The original members were Reynolds, Johnson, Burke, Goldsmith, Christopher Nugent, Topham Beauclerk, Bennet Langton, Anthony Chamier, and Sir John Hawkins. Others were added later by vote of the club: Gibbon, Garrick, Sheridan, Fox, Adam Smith, Dr. Burney, etc. Boswell did not win admission till 1773, partly, it may be, because he was only occasionally in London. During the 21 years between his meeting with Johnson and Johnson's death, he spent no more than 2 years and a few weeks within reach of his idol. The unconcealed warmth of his admiration and Johnson's awareness that Boswell was planning a biography of him made the older man forgive the Scots' almost sycophantic idolatry. A good talker and a good listener make a happy couple. Johnson had no high regard for Boswell's brains. When Bozzy, as he called him, remarked that the wine he had drunk in the course of their conversation had given him a headache, Johnson corrected him. "Nay, sir, it was not the wine that made your headache, but the sense that I put into it." "What, sir?" Boswell exclaimed. "Will sense make the head ache?" "Yes, sir, when it is not used to it." There are passages in the life where Boswell seems to be talking better sense than Johnson. Praising Pope's Dunciad, Johnson noted that it had given some dunces a lasting fame, and continued his fun. "It was worth while being a dunce then. Ah, sir, hadst thou lived in those days." But the aging bear soon learned to like his cub. "There are few people whom I take so much to as you," he told him in 1763. "Boswell," he said, "never left a house without leaving a wish for his return." In 1775, Boswell was given a room in Johnson's lodgings to sleep in when the conversation had kept him late. On March 31, 1772, he wrote in his journal, "I have constant plan to write the life of Mr. Johnson. I have not told him of it yet, nor do I know if I should tell him." But Johnson knew of it by April 1773, if not sooner. Others knew of it, and resented Boswell's way of raising controversial questions with the evident aim of drawing the old master out and getting some new gem for the biography. The inquisitive Scot boasted that the fountain was at times locked up till I opened the spring. The Johnson that we know and relish might never have taken form without the stimulus of Boswell's fond provocation and tireless pursuit. How different is the Johnson that we find in Hawkins's life, or even in the lively anecdotes of Mrs. Thrale. It was in January 1765 that Johnson began with the Thrales, an association that played a larger part in his life than his friendship for Boswell. Henry Thrale was a brewer, son of a brewer. He had received a good education, had travelled, and was to certify his status by being elected to Parliament. In 1763 he married Hester Lynch Salisbury, a Welsh girl only 5 feet tall, but vivacious and intelligent. Henry, 12 years her senior, absorbed himself in his business, but attended to his wife sufficiently to make her pregnant annually between 1764 and 1778, and to convey to her his venereal infection. She bore him 12 children, of whom 8 died in infancy. She solaced herself with literature, and when her husband brought home with him the famous Samuel Johnson, she used all her feminine arts and graces to attach him to the family. Soon he was dining with the Thrales every Thursday in their Southwark home, and from 1766 onward he usually spent the summer with them in their country villa at Streatham, in Surrey. With Johnson as a centre, Mrs. Thrale made her home a salon, to which came Reynolds, Goldsmith, Garrick, Burke, the Burneys, and finally, and jealously, Boswell, for he learned that Mrs. Thrale was gathering notes about her lion's looks and ways and words. So the life was to have a rival. 4. Ursus Major. What was the Great Bear like? Boswell, after their first meeting in 1763, wrote, "Mr. Johnson is a man of a most dreadful appearance, a very big man, troubled with sore eyes, the palsy, a nervous tic, and the king's evil. He is very slovenly in his dress, and speaks with a most uncouth voice." Mrs. Thrale described him in his later years. His stature was remarkably high, and his limbs exceedingly large. His features strongly marked, his countenance particularly rugged. His sight was near and otherwise imperfect, yet his eyes were so wild, so piercing, and at times so fierce, that fear was, I believe, the first emotion in the eyes of all his beholders. He deplored as a waste of time the hours spent in sitting for a portrait. However, he did this 10 times for Reynolds and once for a bust by Nollekens. In 1756, Sir Joshua showed him as already stout and indolent. In 1770 he painted him in profile and made him look like Goldsmith. In 1772 the most famous of the portraits delivered him to posterity as a man of ungainly bulk, enormous wig, large full face, lowering brows over puzzled eyes, massive nose, thick lips, and double chin. His wig was repeatedly dislodged by convulsive movements of his head, shoulders, and hands. He was careless in his dress. "Fine clothes," he told Boswell, "are good only as they supply the want of other means of procuring respect." Not until he became a guest of the Thrales did he bother much about personal hygiene. He ate voraciously, having much space to fill, and perhaps recalling hungry years. Boswell reported, "I never knew any man who relished good eating more than he did. When at table he was totally absorbed in the business of the moment. His looks seemed riveted to his plate. Nor would he, unless when in very high company, say one word or pay the least attention to what was said by others, till he had satisfied his appetite, which was so fierce that the veins of his forehead swelled, and generally a strong perspiration was visible. He ate fish with his fingers, because I am short-sighted and afraid of bones. He could hardly bear the sight of vegetables. In his heartier days he loved to exhilarate himself with wine, but was never intoxicated but once. When Mrs. Williams denounced drunkenness, saying, "I wonder what pleasure men can take in making beasts of themselves," Johnson retorted, "I wonder, madam, that you have not penetration enough to see the strong inducement to this excess, for he who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man." But drinking, he said, does not improve conversation. It alters the mind, so that you are pleased with any conversation. In later life he shunned all liquor, and contented himself with chocolate, lemonade, and countless cups of tea. He never smoked. It is a shocking thing, blowing smoke out of our mouths into other people's mouths, eyes, and noses, and having the same thing done to us. He explained the habit of smoking as preserving the mind from utter vacuity. His boorish manners were partly a relic of his days and nights in the lower depths, partly the result of physical irritations and mental fears. He was strong and proud of it. He could knock down a bookseller with little fear of retaliation. He could pick up and throw aside a man who had dared to occupy a chair that Johnson had temporarily vacated. He mounted a horse and joined Thrale in a 50-mile cross-country fox hunt. But he had difficulty in carrying his own weight. When he walked the streets, what with the constant roll of his head and the concomitant motion of his body, he appeared to make his way by that motion, independent of his feet. When he rode, he had no command or direction of his horse, but was carried as if in a balloon. He suffered, after 1776, from asthma, gout, and dropsy. These and other physical difficulties must have intensified his melancholy, which at times so depressed him that I would consent to have a limb amputated to recover my spirits. He would not believe that any man was happy. Of one who claimed to be so, he said, "It is all cant. The dog knows he is miserable all the time." A physician having told him that hypochondria sometimes led to insanity, Johnson feared that he would go insane. Of the uncertainties of our present state, he made Imlac say in Rasselas, the most dreadful and alarming is the uncertain continuance of reason. Being nearsighted, he found little pleasure in the beauty of women, nature, or art. He thought sculpture was overrated. The value of statuary is owing to its difficulty. You would not value the finest head cut upon a carrot. He tried to learn some musical instrument, but I never made out a tune. "Pray, sir," he asked, "who is this Bach? Is he a piper?" Referring to Johann Christian Bach, then in 1771 the most famous pianist in England. He felt that music was being spoiled by digital acrobatics. Hearing a violinist praised because the feats he performed were so difficult, Johnson exclaimed, "Difficult? I wish it had been impossible." So vigorous a man must have found it troublesome to deal with the sexual fancies that agitate even the normal mind. When he attended the premiere of Irene and was brought by Garrick into the green room where the players waited between scenes, he rejected a suggestion that he repeat this visit. "No, David, I will never come back, for the white bubbies and the silk stockings of your actresses excite my genitals." Boswell was astonished to hear him say, one day in the Hebrides, "I have often thought that if I kept a seraglio—" In general, his faults were more obvious than his virtues, which were quite as real. We might justly invert Horace Walpole's comment that though he was good-natured at bottom, he was very ill-natured at top. Goldsmith said the same thing more graciously. Johnson has a roughness in his manner, but no man alive has a more tender heart. He has nothing of the bear but the skin. Untidy, indolent, superstitious, rude, dogmatic, proud, he was also kind, humane, generous, quick to ask forgiveness and to forgive. Mrs. Thrale reckoned that Johnson gave away £200 of his £300 pension, and she added, "He nursed whole nests of people in his house. Commonly spending the middle of the week at our house, he kept his numerous family in Fleet Street upon a settled allowance, but returned to them every Saturday to give them 3 good dinners and his company before he came back to us on the Monday night, treating them with the same or perhaps more ceremonious civility than he would have done by as many people of fashion. He wrote prefaces, dedications, sermons, even legal opinions for others, often gratis. He labored by word and pen to save Dr. William Dodd from the gallows. Seeing a prostitute lying in the street, he, then 75, took her on his back, carried her to his rooms, cared for her till she was well, and endeavored to put her in a virtuous way of living. George Steevens, who collaborated with him in editing Shakespeare, said, "Could the many bounties he studiously concealed, the many acts of humanity he performed in private, be displayed with equal circumstantiality as his frailties, his defects would be so far lost in the blaze of his virtues that the latter only would be regarded." In the last 19 years of his life, he wrote only one substantial book, Lives of the Poets. Otherwise, he substituted the tongue for the pen. He described himself as a man who loves to fold his legs and have out his talk. If we leave eating aside, he lived most when he was talking to an intelligent company. He had gathered, by observation and reading, an extraordinary fund and range of knowledge about human affairs. He carried much of it in his lumber room of memory. and he welcomed a chance to unburden himself. Yet he seldom initiated any serious discussion. He spoke up only when someone raised a subject or a challenge. He was always tempted to oppose what another had said. He was ready to defend any proposition or its opposite. He relished debate, knowing himself invincible, and he was resolved to win the argument, even if truth should perish beneath his blows. He knew that this was not the finest kind of conversation, but he was sure that it was the most interesting. In the heat and zest of the conflict, he found little place for courtesy. "He spared none of us," said Boswell. To one disputant, "I have found you an argument, but I am not obliged to find you an understanding." "There is no arguing with Johnson," said Goldsmith, "for if his pistol misses fire, he knocks you down with the butt." "When I called upon Dr. Johnson next morning," Boswell relates, "I found him highly satisfied with his colloquial powers the preceding evening. 'Well,' said he, 'we had a good talk.' Boswell, 'Yes, sir, you tossed and gored several persons.' Thomas Sheridan called him a bully, and Gibbon called him a bigot. Lord Monboddo called him the most invidious and malignant man I have ever known, who praised no author or book that other people praised. He praised Fanny Burney's Evelina, and could not with any patience hear any other person draw the attention of the company for ever so short a time." Horace Walpole, secure in his sinecures, shuddered at thought of him, and summed him up as seen by the son of a Whig prime minister. With a lumber of learning and some strong points, Johnson was an odious and mean character. By principle a Jacobite, arrogant, self-sufficient, and overbearing, he had prostituted his pen to party even in a dictionary, and had afterwards for a pension contradicted his own definitions. His manners were sordid, supercilious, and brutal, his style ridiculously bombastic and vicious, and in one word, with all the pedantry, he had all the gigantic littleness of a country schoolmaster. What will posterity think of us when it reads what an idol we adored? Ideally, of course, the best conversation is in a small, unhurried group where all are informed and courteous, or, as Johnson put it in an amiable interlude, that is the happiest conversation where there is no competition, no vanity, but a calm, quiet interchange of sentiments. But when did he have that experience? "Treating your adversary with respect," he told Boswell, presumably with a twinkle in his eye, "is giving him an advantage to which he is not entitled. We who never felt his butt forgive him all those blows and insults and prejudices, because his wit and humor and penetration, his preference of realities to pretenses, of candor to cant, and his capacity for concentrating wisdom in a phrase, make him one of the most dominating characters in English history." 5. The conservative mind. Shall we give him the floor? He had something interesting to say on almost everything under the sun. He thought life a misfortune, which no one would want to repeat, and which most people supported with impatience and quitted with reluctance. When Lady Macleod asked him if no man was naturally good, he answered, "No, madam, no more than a wolf." Men are evidently so corrupt that all the laws of heaven and earth are insufficient to restrain them from crimes. Men hate more sturdily than they love, and if I have said something to hurt a man once, I shall not get the better of this by saying many things to please him. He did not often discuss economics. He denounced the exploitation of colonial peoples, and strongly condemned slavery. Once, at Oxford, he astonished some professors by proposing a toast to the insurrection of the Negroes in the West Indies. However, he thought that raising the wages of day laborers is wrong, for it does not make them live better, but, said the idler, only makes them idler, and idleness is a very bad thing for human nature. Like Blackstone, he upheld the sanctity of property rights. And like his antipodes, Voltaire, he defended luxury as giving work to the poor instead of corroding them with charity. He anticipated Adam Smith in advocating free enterprise, but the multiplication of merchants irritated him. "I am afraid the increase of commerce and the incessant struggle for riches which commerce excites gives no prospect of an end speedily to be expected of artifice and fraud. violence gives way to cunning. He made no pretense of despising money, having suffered from its lack, and he thought that no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money, which underestimated vanity. He felt, recall the lines he added to Goldsmith's Traveller, that we exaggerate the importance of politics. I would not give half a crown to live under one form of government rather than another. Hence, most schemes of political improvement are very laughable things. Yet he had been hot against the Whig dogs, and it took a pension to reconcile him to the Hanoverians. He called patriotism the last refuge of a scoundrel, but he defended with patriotic warmth the right of Britain to the Falkland Islands in 1771, and he had an almost chauvinistic scorn of the Scots and the French. He quite anticipated, in 1763, Burke's apologia for conservatism. Human experience, which is constantly contradicting theory, is the great test of truth. A system built on the discoveries of a great many minds is always of more strength than what is produced by the mere workings of any one mind. After 1762, he was quite content with the status quo. He praised the British government as approaching nearer to perfection than anything that experience has shown us or history related. He admired aristocracy and class distinctions and privileges as necessary for social order and prudent legislation. I am a friend to subordination. It is most conducive to the happiness of society. Submission is the duty of the ignorant, and content the virtue of the poor. He mourned, like every generation, that subordination is sadly broken down in this age. No man now has the same authority which his father had, except a jailer. No master has it over his servants. It is diminished in our colleges, nay, in our grammar schools. There are many causes, the chief of which is, I think, the great increase of money. Gold and silver destroy feudal subordination. But besides, there is a general relaxation of reverence. No son now depends upon his father as in former times. My hope is that as anarchy produces tyranny, this extreme relaxation will produce freni strictio, a tightening of the reins. Contemplating the London populace, Johnson judged that democracy would be a disaster. He laughed at liberty and equality as impracticable shibboleths. So far is it from being true that men are naturally equal that no two people can be half an hour together but one shall acquire an evident superiority over the other. In 1770 he wrote a pamphlet, The False Alarm, condemning radicalism and justifying the exclusion of Wilkes from Parliament. In another pamphlet, The Patriot, from 1774, Johnson renewed his attack on Wilkes and moved on to what Boswell called an attempt to reduce our fellow subjects in America to unconditional submission. In earlier writings, Johnson had spoken with occasional impartiality on the American colonies. These had been snatched upon no very just principles of policy, largely because other European states were snatching too much, and England wished to protect herself from a France and a Spain made dangerously strong by absorbing America. He had praised the French colonists for treating the Indians humanely and intermarrying with them, and he had condemned the British colonists for defrauding the Indians and oppressing the Negroes. But when the colonists talked of liberty, justice, and natural rights, Johnson scorned their claims as specious cant, and asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" He stated the case against the emancipation of the colonies in a powerful brochure, Taxation No Tyranny, from 1775. This was apparently written at the request of the ministry, for Johnson complained, says Boswell, that his pension had been given him as a literary character, and now he had been applied by the administration to write political pamphlets. By accepting the protection of Great Britain, Johnson argued, the colonists had implicitly recognized the right of the British government to tax them. Taxation, to be just, did not require the direct representation of the taxed persons in the government. Half the population of England was without representatives in Parliament, and yet it accepted taxation as a fair return for the social order and legal protection provided by the government. Hawkins, who had supplied Johnson with arguments, thought that Taxation No Tyranny has never received an answer. But Boswell, remembering Corsica, took the American side, deplored the extreme violence of Johnson's pen, and said that this pamphlet was written at the desire of those who were then in power, I have no doubt, and indeed he owned to me that it had been revised and curtailed by some of them. One passage, deleted by the ministry, predicted that the Americans would, in a century and a quarter, be more than equal to the inhabitants of Western Europe. There were some liberal elements in his political philosophy. He preferred Fox to Pitt II, and was induced to dine with Wilkes, who overcame Johnson's political principles by helping him to some fine veal. And in one passage the old Tory flirted with revolution. When we consider in abstracted speculation the unequal distribution of the pleasures of life, when it is apparent that many want the necessaries of nature, and many more the comforts and conveniences of life, that the idle live at ease by the fatigues of the diligent, and the luxurious are pampered with delicacies untasted by those who supply them, when the greater number must always want, or lack, what the smaller are enjoying and squandering without use, it seems impossible to conceive that the peace of society can long subsist. It were natural to expect that no man would be left long in possession of superfluous enjoyments, while such numbers are destitute of real necessaries. His conservatism returned to full force when he spoke of religion. After a youthful year of skepticism, he gave increasingly ardent support to the doctrines and privileges of the established church. Sometimes he inclined to Catholicism. He liked the idea of purgatory, and when he heard that an Anglican clergyman had been converted to the Roman Church, he said, "God bless him." He defended the Inquisition, Boswell tells us, and maintained that false doctrine should be checked on its first appearance, that the civil power should unite with the Church in punishing those who dare to attack the established religion, and that such only were punished by the Inquisition. He hated dissenters and applauded the expulsion of Methodists from Oxford. He refused to speak to a lady who left the established church to join the Quakers. He reproved Boswell for his mild friendship with the atheist Hume. When Adam Smith assured him that Hume led an exemplary life, Johnson cried out, "You lie!" To which Smith retorted, "You are a son of a bitch." Johnson felt that religion was indispensable to social order and morality, and that only the hope of a happy immortality could reconcile one to the tribulations of earthly life. He believed in angels and devils, and thought that we are all to reside hereafter either in the regions of horror or bliss. He accepted the reality of witches and ghosts. He believed that his dead wife had appeared to him. He did not care for science. He praised Socrates for trying to turn investigation from the stars to man. He abhorred vivisection. He took no interest in exploration. The discovery of unknown lands would only lead to conquest and robbery. He thought philosophy was an intellectual labyrinth leading either to religious doubt or to metaphysical nonsense. So he refuted Berkeley's idealism by kicking a stone, and defended free will by telling Boswell, "We know our will is free, and there's an end on't. All theory is against the freedom of the will, all experience for it." He rejected with disgust the whole philosophy of the French Enlightenment. He denied the right of an individual mind, however brilliant, to sit in judgment on institutions that the trial-and-error experience of the race had built up to protect social order against the unsocial impulses of men. He felt that the Catholic Church, with all its faults, was performing a vital function in preserving French civilization, and he condemned as shallow fools the philosophes who were weakening the religious supports of the moral code. Voltaire and Rousseau seemed to him two varieties of imbecile. Voltaire an intellectual fool, Rousseau a sentimental fool. But the difference between them was so slight that it was difficult to settle the proportion of iniquity between them. He reproved Boswell for courting Rousseau in Switzerland, and deplored the hospitality that England was offering the author of Emile in 1766. "Rousseau, sir, is a very bad man. I would sooner sign a sentence for his transportation than that of any felon who has gone from the Old Bailey these many years. "Yes, sir, I should like to have him work in the plantations." Johnson was not as conservative as his opinions. He gaily broke 100 conventions in conduct, speech, and dress. He was not a prig. He laughed at the Puritans. He favored dancing, card-playing, the theater. However, he condemned Fielding's Tom Jones and was shocked to hear that prim Hannah More had read it. He was afraid of sensuality in literature because he had difficulty in suppressing his own sensual impulses and imagination. One would have supposed from his doctrines that he had not enjoyed life, but we can see in Boswell that he relished the full tide of human existence. He pronounced life painful and worthless, but like most of us, he prolonged it as much as he could, and faced with angry reluctance his declining years. 6. Autumn, 1763 to 1780. In 1765 he moved from the Inner Temple to a 3-story house at No. 7 Johnson's Court in Fleet Street. It was named after an earlier resident. There Boswell found him on returning from the Continent. In July he was given the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws by the University of Dublin. Now for the first time he was Dr. Johnson, but he never attached the title to his name. In October 1765 he issued in 8 volumes his edition of Shakespeare, 8 years later than he had promised it to his subscribers. He dared to point out faults, absurdities, and childish verbal conceits in the Bard. He censured him for having no moral purpose. He thought that Shakespeare had left perhaps not one play which, if it were now exhibited as the work of a contemporary writer, would be heard to the conclusion. But he praised the poet for subordinating the love interest in the greater dramas, and for making his protagonists not heroes but men. And he vigorously defended, against Voltaire, Shakespeare's neglect of the unities of time and place. Critics challenged many of his comments and corrections. The edition was superseded by Edmund Malone's in 1790, but Malone acknowledged that his own edition was based on Johnson's, and he overvalued Johnson's preface as perhaps the finest composition in our language. In 1767, while visiting Buckingham Palace, Johnson came upon George III. They exchanged compliments. Meanwhile, the friendship with Boswell warmed to such a degree that in 1773 Johnson accepted his admirer's invitation to join him in a tour of the Hebrides. It was a brave undertaking for a man of 64. It began with a long and arduous stagecoach ride from London to Edinburgh. There he met Robertson, but refused to meet Hume. On August 18th, he and Boswell and a servant started north in a post-chaise along the east coast to Aberdeen. Thence they struck across the rugged highlands through Banff to Inverness, and then mostly on horseback through Annoch to Glenelg on the west coast. There they took a boat to the island of Skye, which they toured rather thoroughly from September 2nd to October 3rd. They encountered many hardships, which Johnson took with glum courage. He slept upon hay in barns, evaded vermin, clambered over rocks, and rode with precarious dignity on ponies hardly larger than himself. At one stop a lady of the MacDonald clan sat on his knee and kissed him. "Do it again," he said, "and let us see who will tire first." On October 3rd, the party left by open boat for a 40-mile ride to the island of Call, and thence to the island of Mull. They crossed back to the mainland on October 22nd, and then traveled through Argyllshire via Dumbarton and Glasgow to Auchinleck on November 2nd. There Johnson met Boswell's father, who entertained him honorably, though lamenting his anti-Scot prejudices. They had a debate so violent that Boswell refused to record it. Boswell Sr. afterward dubbed Johnson Ursa Major, which the son gracefully interpreted as meaning not Great Bear, but a constellation of genius and learning. The travelers reached Edinburgh November 9th, 83 days after leaving it. Looking back upon their hardships, they heartily laughed at the ravings of those absurd visionaries who have attempted to persuade us of the specious advantages of a state of nature. Johnson left Edinburgh November 22nd and reached London on the 26th. In 1775 he published A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. It was not as racy as even the Bowdlerized account that Boswell issued in 1785 as a journal of a tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson, for philosophy is less interesting than biography, but some passages have a placid beauty that reveal Johnson again as a master of English prose. On April 1st, 1775, Oxford finally came around to giving Johnson the honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Law. In March 1776, he moved for the last time to No. 8 Bolt Court, taking his motley family with him. In a strange mood of exuberance, he wrote to the Lord Chamberlain on April 11, 1776, asking for an apartment in Hampton Court Palace. "I hope that to a man who has had the honor of vindicating His Majesty's government, a retreat in one of his houses may not be improperly or unworthily allowed." The Lord Chamberlain regretted that there was a surfeit of applicants. One more achievement remained. 40 London booksellers joined in preparing a many-volumed edition of the English poets, and asked Johnson to introduce each poet with a biography. They let him name his terms. He required £200. Had he asked 1,000 or even 1,500 guineas, said Malone, the booksellers who knew the value of his name would doubtless have readily given it. Johnson had thought of writing little lives. He forgot that one of the laws of composition is that a pen in motion, like matter in Newton's first law, continues in motion unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it from without. Of the minor poets he wrote with laudable brevity, but with Milton, Addison, and Pope he let himself go, and wrote essays of 60, 42, 102 pages that are among the finest specimens of literary criticism in the English language. His view of Milton was colored by his dislike of the Puritans, their politics, and their regicide. He read Milton's prose as well as his verse, and called him an acrimonious and surly republican. The essay on Pope, which in the original edition ran to 373 pages, was the last blow struck for the classic style in English poetry by the greatest inheritor of that style in English prose. He, who knew Greek well, supposed that Pope's translation of the Iliad had improved upon Homer. He praised Gray's elegy, but dismissed the odes as cluttered with mythological machinery. When the 10 volumes of the Lives of the Poets were published between 1779 and 1781, some readers were shocked by Johnson's unorthodox but pontifical judgments, his insensitivity to the subtler graces of poetry, his tendency to rate and berate poets according to the moral tendency of their poems and their lives. Walpole declared, "Dr. Johnson has indubitably neither taste nor ear nor criterion of judgment but his old woman's prejudices," and laughed at this weight on stilts who seems to have read the ancients with no view but of pilfering polysyllables. Why, then, are these lives more widely and fondly read than any other product of Johnson's pen? Perhaps because of those very prejudices and the candor of their expression. He made literary criticism a living force and almost raised the dead with his chastisements. 7. Release, 1781 to 1784. There is a secret pride in surviving our contemporaries, but we are punished with loneliness. The death of Henry Thrale on April 4, 1781, was the beginning of the end for Johnson. He served as one of 4 executors of the brewer's will, but thereafter his visits to the Thrale family lessened. Long before her husband's death, Mrs. Thrale had begun to weary of the strains put upon her by Johnson's need for attentions and attentive ears. Thrale had kept his captive bear in reasonably good behavior, but, the widow complained, when there was nobody to restrain his, Johnson's, dislikes, it was extremely difficult to find anybody with whom he could converse without living always on the verge of a quarrel. Such accidents occurred too often, and I was forced to retire to Bath, where I knew Mr. Johnson would not follow me. The Morning Post made matters worse by announcing that a treaty of marriage between Johnson and Mrs. Thrale was on tap. Boswell composed a burlesque ode by Samuel Johnson to Mrs. Thrale upon their supposed approaching nuptials. But in 1782 Johnson was 73, and Mrs. Thrale was 41. It was not of her own will that she had married Thrale. He had often neglected her, and she had never learned to love him. Now she claimed a right to love and be loved and to find a mate for the second half of her life. She was at an age when a woman urgently longs for some physical and understanding companionship. Even before her husband's death, she had developed a fondness for Gabriel Piozzi, who was giving music lessons to her daughters. Born in Italy, he had taken up residence in England in 1776 and was now about 42 years old. When she first met him at a party given by Dr. Burney, she mimicked his mannerisms as he performed at the piano. But his elegant manners, his amiable temper, and his musical accomplishments made him a relieving contrast to Johnson. Now that she was free, she abandoned herself to romance. She confessed to her 4 surviving daughters her desire for remarriage. They were alarmed. Remarriage would affect their financial expectations. Marriage to a musician, worse yet, a Roman Catholic, would hurt their social standing. They pleaded with their mother to reconsider. She tried and failed. Piozzi behaved like a gentleman. He went off to Italy in April 1783 and stayed away almost a year. When he returned in March 1784 and found Mrs. Thrales still eager, he yielded. The daughters refused their consent and moved to Brighton. On June 30th, Mrs. Thrales sent Johnson an announcement that she and Piozzi were to be married. He replied on July 2nd, 1784, "Madam, if I interpret your letter aright, you are ignominiously married. If it is yet undone, let us once more talk together. If you have abandoned your children and your religion, God forgive your wickedness. If you have forfeited your fame," meaning reputation, "and your country, may your folly do no further mischief. If the last act is yet to do, I, who have loved you, esteemed you, reverenced you, and served you, I, who long thought you the first of womankind, entreat that before your fate is irrevocable, I may once more see you. I once was, madam, most truly yours, Samuel Johnson." Mrs. Thrale resented the word ignominious as a slur on her fiancé. She answered Johnson on July 4th, "Till you have changed your opinion of Mr. Piozzi, let us converse no more." She married Piozzi on July 23rd. All London agreed with Johnson in condemning her. On November 11th, Johnson told Fanny Burney, "I never speak of her, and I desire never to hear of her more." These events must have taken a toll of Johnson's failing vitality. He found it increasingly difficult to sleep and resorted to opium to ease his pains and quiet his nerves. On January 16, 1782, his doctor in ordinary, Robert Levitt, died. Whose turn would it be next? Johnson had always feared death. Now this and his belief in hell made his final years a mixture of heavy dinners and theological terrors. "I am afraid I may be one of those who shall be damned," he told Dr. William Adams, master of Pembroke College. And when Adams asked what he meant by damned, he cried out, "Sent to hell, sir, and punished everlastingly." Boswell could not help contrasting the calm with which the unbelieving Hume had approached his end. On June 17, 1783, Johnson suffered a mild stroke. "A confusion and indirectness in my head, which lasted, I suppose, half a minute. My speech was taken from me. I had no pain." A week later, he was well enough to dine at the club, and in July he astonished his intimates by making excursions to Rochester and Salisbury. "What a man am I," he exclaimed to Hawkins, "who have got the better of 3 diseases, the palsy, the gout, and the asthma, and can now enjoy the conversation of my friends." But on September 6th, Mrs. Williams died, and his loneliness became intolerable. Finding the club insufficient, for several of the old members, Goldsmith, Garrick, Beauclerk, were dead, and some of the new ones were distasteful to him, he founded in December 1783 the Evening Club, which met in an alehouse in Essex Street. There any decent person, by paying 3d, might come in and hear him talk 3 nights a week. He invited Reynolds to join. Sir Joshua refused. Hawkins and others thought the new club a degradation of those powers which had given delight to more august persons. On June 3rd, 1784, he was well enough to journey with Boswell to Lichfield and Oxford. Returning to London, Boswell persuaded Reynolds and other friends to ask the Chancellor to provide money whereby Johnson might be enabled to take a trip to Italy for his health. Johnson said he would prefer a doubling of his pension. The Chancellor refused. On July 2nd, Boswell left for Scotland. He never saw Johnson again. The asthma that had been overcome returned, and dropsy was added. "My breath is very short," he wrote to Boswell in November 1784, "and the water is now increasing upon me." Reynolds, Burke, Langton, Fanny Burney, and others came to bid him a last good-bye. He wrote his will. He left £2,000, of which 1,500 were bequeathed to his Negro servant. Several doctors treated him, refusing any fee. He begged them to lance his legs more deeply. They would not. When they were gone, he plunged lancets or scissors deep into his calves, hoping to release more water and reduce the painful swelling. Some water came, but also 10 ounces of blood. That evening, December 13th, 1784, he died. A week later, he was buried in Westminster Abbey. He was the strangest figure in literary history, stranger even than Scarron or Pope. It is at first acquaintance hard to like him. He covered his tenderness with brutality, and the coarseness of his manners rivaled the propriety of his books. No one received so much adulation and gave so little praise. But the older we become, the more wisdom we find in his words. He surrounded his wisdom with platitudes, but he elevated platitudes to epigrams by the force or color of his speech. We might compare him with Socrates, who also talked at the slightest provocation, and is remembered for his spoken words. Both were stimulating gadflies, but Socrates asked questions and gave no answers. Johnson asked no questions and answered all. Socrates was certain about nothing, Johnson was certain about everything. Both appealed to science to leave the stars alone and study man. Socrates faced death like a philosopher and with a smile. Johnson faced it with religious tremors, rivaling his enervating pains. No one now idealizes him. We can understand why the English aristocracy, excepting Langton and Beauclerk, avoided him and ignored his pontificate. We realize what a John Bull he would have been in the china shop of the nobility, or amid the precious bric-a-brac of Strawberry Hill. He was not designed for beauty, but he served to frighten some of us out of cant, hypocrisy, and gush, and to make us look at ourselves with fewer delusions about the nature of man or the ecstasies of freedom. There must have been something lovable in a man to whom Reynolds and Burke and Goldsmith could listen through 1,001 nights, and something fascinating in one who could inspire a great biography and fill its 1,200 pages with enduring life. 8. Boswell Moriturus. When the Great Bear was dead, the literary flock swarmed about him to draw some sustenance from his corpse. Boswell himself did not hurry. He worked for 7 years on the life. But he issued in 1785 his Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson. It reached a 3rd edition in 1 year. Hester Thrale Piozzi had gathered material about Johnson's words and ways. Now, from these Thraliana, she compiled anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, LL.D., during the last 20 years of his life, published in 1786. The little book presented a less amiable picture of her guest than she had drawn day by day in her diary. Doubtless the final letters of Johnson had left a lasting wound. Next in the arena, barring a dozen entries now forgotten, was The Life of Samuel Johnson, published in 5 sumptuous volumes by Sir John Hawkins in 1787. Hawkins had had sufficient success as an attorney to be knighted in 1772, and sufficient learning to write a good history of music in 1776. He joined with Johnson in organizing the Ivy Lane Club in 1749, and was one of the original members of the club. He left this after an argument with Burke, which caused Johnson to dub him an unclubbable man. But Johnson remained his friend, often sought his advice, and appointed him one of the executors of his will. Soon after Johnson's death, a group of booksellers asked Hawkins to edit an edition of the doctor's works, and to introduce it with a biography. This was criticized as revealing Johnson's faults without mercy, and Boswell later questioned its accuracy. But the charges against it cannot be sustained in a fair hearing. Nearly all the faults ascribed to Johnson by Hawkins were noted by other contemporaries. Mrs. Piozzi returned to the feast with letters to and from the late Samuel Johnson in 1788. All fascinating, for Johnson's letters, except the last one to his lost lady, were far more humane than his speech. Meanwhile, Boswell was laboring patiently between lawsuits and carouses on what he was resolved to make an incomparable biography. He had begun to make memoranda of Johnson's conversation soon after their first meeting in 1763. He planned the life as early as 1772. So lengthy and laborious was this gestation. He rarely took notes on the spot, and he could not write shorthand, but he made it a principle to jot down, on returning to his room, his memory of what had happened or had been said. He began writing the life of Samuel Johnson in London on July 9, 1786. He ran about the city seeking data from Johnson's surviving friends. Edmund Malone, the Shakespearean scholar, helped him to sort out his huge chaos of notes, and buttressed his courage when Boswell, broken down by dissipation, grief, and the death of his wife, seemed about to abandon himself to women and drink. Boswell wrote in 1789, "You cannot imagine what labor, what perplexity, what vexation I have endured in arranging a prodigious multiplicity of materials, in supplying omissions, in searching for papers buried in different masses, and all this besides the exertion of composing and polishing. Many a time I have thought of giving it up." He took from William Mason's Life and Letters of Gray, of 1774, the idea of interspersing his hero's letters with the story. He deliberately accumulated details, feeling that these would add up to a full and vivid picture. The fragments were woven into a chronological narrative and a consistent whole. Was he accurate? He claimed to be. I am so nice in recording him that every trifle must be authentic. Where we can check his report of Johnson's words with other accounts, it seems factually correct, though not verbatim. A comparison of his notebook with the life shows that Boswell turned his own summary of Johnson's speech into direct quotation, which he sometimes expanded, sometimes compressed, sometimes improved, sometimes purified, elongating certain four-letter words to respectable proportions. Occasionally he omitted facts unfavorable to himself. He did not claim to have told the whole truth about Johnson, but when Hannah More begged him to mitigate some of Johnson's asperities, he replied that he would not cut off Johnson's claws, nor make a tiger a cat to please anybody. Actually, he revealed his master's faults as fully as others had done, but in a large perspective that reduced their prominence. He tried to show as much of the complete man as affection and decency would permit. I am absolutely certain, he said, that my mode of biography, which gives not only a history of Johnson's visible progress through the world, and of his publication, but a view of his mind in his letters and conversations, is the most perfect that can be conceived, and will be more of a life than any work that has ever yet appeared. At last it came from the press, in 2 large volumes, in May 1791. It was not at once recognized as a unique treasure. Many persons resented Boswell's reporting of their private conversation, not always admirable. Lady Diana Beauclerk was able to read how Johnson had called her a whore. Reynolds saw where Johnson had reproved him for drinking too much. Burke learned that Johnson had questioned his political integrity, and had thought him capable of picking up a prostitute. Mrs. Piozzi and Mrs. Elizabeth Montagu winced. Dr. Blagden, wrote Horace Walpole, says justly that it is a new kind of libel by which you may abuse anybody by saying some dead person said so-and-so of somebody alive. Others found the detail excessive, many letters trivial, some pages dull. Only gradually did England realize that Boswell had achieved a masterpiece and had given some nobility to his life. His father had died in 1782. leaving him Laird of Auchinleck with an income of £1,600 a year. He proved to be a kindly master, but he was too accustomed to city life to remain long in Auchinleck. In 1786 he was admitted to the English bar, and thereafter he spent most of his time in London. Reynolds portrayed him in that year, confident and insolent, with a nose fit to ferret out any secret. At times his wife accompanied him to London, but usually she lived at Auchinleck. There she died in 1789, aged 51, worn out by the care she had given Boswell and his children. He survived her by 6 years, years of deepening degradation. He tried again and again to overcome his need for liquor, but failed. He died in London, May 19, 1795, aged 56, and his body was taken to Auchinleck for burial. His sins are at present in the public mind, but we shall forget them when we read again the greatest of all biographies. Looking back over this 18th century in English literature, we perceive that it was above all a century of prose, from Addison, Swift, and Defoe to Sterne, Gibbon, and Johnson, just as the 17th century was an age of poetry, from Hamlet and Donne to Dryden and Paradise Lost. The rise of science and philosophy, the decline of religion and mystery, the revival of classic unities and restraints had chilled the warmth and clogged the flow of imagination and aspiration. And the triumph of reason was the defeat of poetry, in France as well as in England. Nevertheless, the vitality and versatility of England's prose literature in the 18th century amply compensated for the frigid formality prevailing in its verse. Through Richardson and Fielding, the novel, which had been, before them, an episodic concatenation of picaresque adventures, became a description and criticism of life, a study of manners, morals, and character, more illuminating than the records of the historians who lost the people in the state. And what literary influence could equal, in that age, the effect of Richardson on Prévost, Rousseau, Diderot, and Goethe? If the literature of England in the 18th century could not equal that of the 17th or match the Elizabethan flight, the total life of England recovered its upward swing after the failure of national courage and policy in the Restoration. Not since the defeat of the Armada had England felt such a surge of enterprise and politics. The years from the rise of Chatham to the death of his son saw the Industrial Revolution put England far ahead of its rivals in economic inventiveness and power, and saw the English Parliament conquering continents while checking its kings. Now the immense British Empire was built. Now the halls of the House of Commons rang with such eloquence as Europe had not heard since Cicero. Now, while France bankrupted itself to free America and decapitated itself to realize its dreams, England brought all its resources of mind and will to evolve without revolution and enter the 19th century in economy and statesmanship, victorious and supreme.